All right, so we're going to look at some ways that macroevolution happens, and we'll look at speciation, and then we'll look at some patterns and processes for evolution. With macroevolution, we're looking at transformation that takes place in more than a single species. We look at speciation, and we'll talk more about this and specific mechanisms that new species form by. We'll look at extinction, so how a species will die out due to lack of adaptations that allow it to survive. We have adaptive radiation and convergent evolution. All of these are examples of macroevolutionary patterns. When we look at macroevolution, new species which emerge can be the basis for macroevolutionary change. And then later we'll look at genetic variation as the basis for evolution within a species or microevolution. So right now we're taking a look at the big picture. We'll also look at genetic variation, changes in allele frequencies within a species as a way of microevolution. So speciation is one way that macroevolution happens. Speciation is a process that normally is caused by genetic isolation from the main population. And so what happens then is over time, a new genetically distinct species forms. This might happen because of biological barriers. It might happen because of behavioral barriers that prevent mating. But basically, the genetic change will spread through the population over time. Once it's split, then the gene pools, or all of the genes that are in a population then, aren't going to combine anymore. Another term that's important to know is species. So a species is going to be a population or a group of populations whose members can interbreed and produce fertile offspring. And so this is kind of our lowest level. We're saying, hey, if you're in a species, they can breed and they can make new offspring. If not, then a new species has formed. This would be an example of speciation. So we have an original species, something happens to create a rift, and the organisms that are on the top, the adaptation that allows them to survive is more of the green-brown adaptation, and so over time that population will become more green and brown versus the bottom, which will stay that yellowy orange. And so the speciation is this idea that different adaptations will allow organisms to survive in a different setting, and eventually over time then they won't be able to breed together. So with speciation, we talk about isolating mechanisms, and these are going to be features that prevent breeding between two different species, and we'll look at a bunch of different types of isolating mechanisms. One type is reproductive isolation, and so this, whenever the gene pool splits, this is because members of the population stop breeding with other members, so they no longer interbreed. Examples of this specifically would be things like behavioral isolation, which is looking at mating rituals, geographic isolation, which is looking at where the organisms and the species are located, and then temporal isolation, which is mating at different times, which then prevents the organisms from interbreeding. Whenever we look at isolating mechanisms, we're really looking at divergent evolution because these species or the organisms are becoming more different from one another over time. So behavioral isolation specifically is looking at populations that are capable of breeding, but they have different courtship rituals. And so there's a sexual selection that occurs, and breeding doesn't happen because the mating songs or the mating dances, if you look at these birds of paradise, they have some interesting courtship rituals. But if they don't match up, then even though they might be capable of breeding, they do not breed. Another type of isolation is ecological. This is whenever individuals in a species breed only in their preferred habitats. So if they only are breeding in their preferred habitats, then they don't meet with other species that are in other habitats. So they don't breed, they don't combine the genetic information, and over time they will likely form a completely new species from one another. When we look at habitats, we're talking about any area that provides organisms with their basic needs for survival. With geographic isolation, we're talking about populations that are separated by barriers like rivers, mountains, or bodies of water. And so what happens is that this is going to cause the gene pools to be separated. So these no longer interbreed, and even though the barriers don't guarantee isolation, typically the populations become different enough over time. Sometimes geographic isolation, once there's a split, then the natural selection occurs where the best adaptations are going to survive the best. but the initial event, like maybe it's an earthquake or flooding or something random, that would be what we call genetic drift, which is going to be evolution by chance rather than based on the traits. Temporal isolation is when two or more species reproduce at different times, so then there's not going to be interbreeding, there's not going to be an exchange of genetic information, and so then over time, two new species will develop. Mechanical isolation is when structural differences prevent mating or pollination. So there's no transfer of sperm because they can't physically mate in order to exchange sperm and to create those new offspring. Gametic isolation, in this case, sperm can be transferred, but it will not fuse with the egg due to chemical differences. So there won't be any formation of a zygote or new offspring, and this occurs due to any sort of chemical difference. So the sperm can't penetrate the egg, and so then there's no formation of that zygote. Other mechanisms of speciation that occur, they can occur due to genetic drift and then also due to adaptive radiation. Genetic drift is a source of evolutionary change where the allele frequency changes and maybe eventually a new species forms, but it occurs by chance rather than being based upon traits. This normally occurs in small populations. It might occur due to the migration of individuals that take certain alleles with them. It might occur due to natural disasters, but over time, a series of chance occurrences can cause a certain allele to become more or less common inside of a population. One type of genetic drift is the founder effect. This is the formation of a new population by a small number of individuals, and so basically this is kind of a migration. If we look at this example, we're seeing, part of the population is going to be founding population A, and just by chance, the bugs in this case are yellow and black, from Pittsburgh, obviously. So whenever they reproduce, they're going to form descendants that are also yellow and black. Compare that to the founding population B, which is going to be yellow and red, and now the population and the descendants that form will have those same traits. The other type of genetic drift that we look at is the bottleneck effect, and this will be the change in allele frequency, which can eventually lead to formation of a new species, but this is following the dramatic reduction in size of a population. So this might be because of a disease or a natural disaster, but basically a lot of the population is going to be eliminated, and so the mixture of alleles will be different. Because of this, it's going to change the traits that the population has, and over time, it's going to create this change. But the reason why the population size was decreased was not based on traits, but really just based on chance occurrence. Speciation can also occur due to adaptive radiation. This is, again, divergent evolution, and this is looking at how organisms will evolve from a common ancestor. Here's just a picture of how evolution might happen over time. So you might have some founders going from South America to the Galapagos Islands, and then you have some geographic isolation within where birds are going to be on different islands in that section. And so that changes the gene pool. So now we have, maybe the green bird was able to survive more in B, the purple one was able to survive in A. Then maybe there's some behavioral isolation, meaning now their mating rituals are different, and so maybe the green bird came back to A, but because there's behavioral isolation and the mating rituals are different, then they don't interbreed. And then over time, you have competition, you have more evolution based on adaptations that are going to be beneficial for the organism to survive. If the rate of speciation is greater than the rate of extinction, then a group of ancestors will continue to survive. But if that is not the case, then you can end up with some extinction. With background extinction, this is a steady process of natural selection that leads to extinction, so organisms just don't have the traits necessary to survive. Sometimes we can also experience mass extinction, where many species become extinct over a short period of time. This might be due to some large event that happens, a large natural disaster, but this can also be caused by a general decrease in biodiversity, meaning not very many different genes within a gene pool. So maybe after a bottleneck, decreased genetic diversity, and so then something else could happen that could then lead to a mass extinction of that species. Extinction can be caused by a few things: changes in environment, use of pesticides or other man-made problems, loss of food or resources, and so the inability or too much competition, inability to reproduce, creation of infertile offspring, which means that those traits won't be passed on. Evolution can occur gradually. This would be that slight modifications are leading to the formation of new species. This might happen because of mutations and any phenotypic changes. This can also be due to a lot of the isolating mechanisms, which are going to be a little more gradual, like behavioral isolation, maybe ecological isolation, but these might occur more slowly over time and become more pronounced to make those new species. Compare this to punctuated equilibrium, which is that species are generally stable over long periods, but then there's occasional rapid changes that create new species. This can occur after species become isolated. Maybe there's a geographic isolation, or it can occur after mass extinction as well. Here's some images that show that. So gradualism, kind of steady over time, versus punctuated equilibrium. Again, this could occur maybe due to founder effect or bottleneck effect. This might lead to a more rapid change or a more rapid formation of species. The last thing that we'll look at with evolution, in terms of different speciation and how the species are related to one another, would be coevolution. And this is that one organism follows the change in another. So this happens with flowers and pollinators, or insects that are eating certain plants. And so as a plant evolves to make poison to prevent insects from eating them, then natural selection favors insects that can counteract the poisons. And so what we see is two species evolving new traits at generally the same rate. If you have questions, please make sure to ask me in class, and we will discuss it further.